Hey everyone, I'm Bryan. Today, I'm going to show you how I made a miniature ghostly winter diorama with some recycled supplies and 3D printed materials. I started this project with some leftover support material from a few 3D prints and the remains of a failed 3D print. The filament that was used was a glow-in-the-dark type, and instead of throwing it in the trash, I collected it and stashed it away until I could find a use for it. I also had a box of wood coasters that someone threw away, and I was surprised to find that the coasters were all intact and clean. I've never tried using a wood coaster as a base for one of my dioramas, so this was going to be a little bit of an experiment. I coated the coaster with a couple layers of Mod Podge to seal the wood. I was planning on adding my texture mix on top, and I wasn't sure if the wood would warp with the moisture. Hopefully the Mod Podge will keep the moisture out. Then I sprayed some primer over the surface. All I had at the time was gray, but I was going to cover most of it and then paint the rest later, so the color didn't really matter. I used a light blue acrylic paint to cover the edge of the coaster. I didn't want to use something too dark that would clash with the rest of the diorama, but I didn't want something too light either, or it might blend in with everything. If you've watched my other videos, then you've probably seen me use a leftover plastic raft from a 3D print as the base for my dioramas. I usually add hot glue around the edge and the underside to stabilize it so it won't slide around. I had a big bag of these rafts, but I'm running out and all I have left are small pieces. After the paint dried, I mixed a batch of my texture paste using a little bit of water, some PVA glue, baking soda, a tiny amount of glow-in-the-dark paint, and a handful of white craft sand. I wanted to make a snowy scene, and since the filament pieces glowed, I used blue glow-in-the-dark paint to try to make the snow glow the same color. I wasn't sure if the mixture would stick to the coaster, even with the primer, so I added more glue than usual to the mix. I may have added too much glue because it was very rubbery afterwards. My plan for the 3D printed pieces was to use the big stringy piece as a platform and the tree pieces as decoration. I was hoping there would be more space to spread everything out, but I didn't measure anything ahead of time, so what I ended up with was a little more symmetrical than I anticipated. I used the rest of the texture paste to fill in some of the gaps around the base of the stringy piece and the trees. I didn't want to fill everything in because I wanted the scene to look like the big piece was partially buried and you could see parts of the glowing aura peeking out. The trees were mostly the same. The texture mix was a lot harder to work with than usual, and as I mentioned earlier, I think that was due to the amount of glue I used. Usually the water, paint, and other liquid materials balances out the baking soda, but the glue made everything too sticky, and the more I mixed it, the denser it became. At one point, it felt like silly putty, so I had to add more water to try and thin it out. In the end, it worked out okay, but I'll have to keep this in mind for other projects. I wasn't sure if the mixture would smooth out as it dried, so the craft sand was added to try and give the surface some additional texture. It's really hard to see on camera, but the sand particles are there and hopefully stay there when everything is dry. I didn't notice it at the time, but the mix was already solidifying even as I was working on it. I put some of the remaining texture mix on top of the trees, but since they weren't secure, I kept knocking them over. I don't know why I didn't think of this earlier, but I should have hot glued all the 3D printed pieces to the coaster and then added the texture mix. Oh well, as long as everything stays in place, it really doesn't matter. The weather is starting to warm up, so I left the piece outside to dry for a few hours. Usually I would need to let a big piece like this dry for at least a day, but the heat accelerated the process. And I'm sure the majority of the texture mix being glue also contributed to that. I was so focused on finishing the project that I didn't test out the glow-in-the-dark features until the very end. So what you'll see next is my first time seeing everything glow. That's all I have for today. Thanks for watching my video and stay tuned for another project next week.